If there's one pitch we've learned more about over the last 3 years than any, it's definitely the sinker. With Hawkeye technology being introduced to the game in 2020, we now have way more clarity for how pitchers such as Blake Trinan and Zach Britton create such unusual amounts of depth on their sinker. This video is going to talk about those sinker variants we see across the league. What's up guys, my name is Chris Slangen and I'm a pitching coordinator here at Driveline Baseball. In this video we're going to talk about the sinker, looking at their different movement variations along with the average pitch metric movement profile across the league. Before getting into the different variations of sinker profiles across the league, you've got to make sure you check out our video on the introduction of pitch movement and spin. This will ensure that you have the necessary context to take on all the things we discuss in this video. Additionally, we've already broken down four-seam profiles in a previous video, so if you're looking for a little more context or to see how the sinker compares to a four-seamer, make sure you check that puppy out. Assuming you have those things contextualized, we're good to move on to sinker profiles. Now, if you've looked at our video on breaking ball profiles, you'll know there's a lot of variety in those pitch shapes across the league. We touched on with our fastball profiles, that variation isn't quite as large, but each inch of vertical break is absolutely necessary to keep in mind when looking at the pitch quality. The same thing occurs with the sinker, where we're looking at depth and arm side run, and each of those inches, especially with depth, and when you get to the elite standard of arm side run, matters quite a bit for projecting the pitch's potential. While the pitch movement of a sinker does correlate pretty strongly with arm angle, the most common route for obtaining this unique movement is through Non-Magnus movement, commonly referred to as seam-shifted wake. With good sinkers, what we're often seeing is pitchers release the ball with a certain release tilt, call it 115, and by the time it gets to the plate, the observed movement values actually suggest that spin direction is closer to, say, 215 or 230. This allows pitchers to generate depth or even gain arm side run after release, and this way they can do it from even higher arm slots, such as Blake Trinan. While we won't get into this topic too deeply, let's take a look at maybe my favorite pitch in all of baseball, Sonny Gray's sinker. While spin efficiency or active spin isn't available on a pitch-to-pitch basis, it is available over the course of the entire season, along with the inferred or spin-based pitch direction, along with the observed pitch direction. With this data, we can reverse engineer Sonny Gray's projected movement values from a purely Magnus standpoint. This will be the spin-induced or inferred movement values. If you look at Gray's sinker, you'll notice that the route the pitch takes to get to its eventual movement metrics, about 9 inches of vertical break and 14 inches of horizontal break, is extremely unique. Out of the hand, the pitch appears to have 14 inches of carry and about 5.5 inches of arm side movement. However, following release, the pitch actually shifts its spin axis mid-flight and gains nearly 10 inches of arm side run. This phenomenon is common in other pitch types as well, and we've discussed them in previous videos, such as the cutter, slider, and changeup. Other pitchers, such as Jeurys Familia, Blake Trinan, and Dylan Tate, also see their sinkers benefit tremendously from this axis deviation. A video with a strict agenda of explaining seam-shifted wake is for another day. We will link some of our blogs on the topic along with Dr. Barton Smith's work. When bucketing these sinker movement values, we went just off of the observed pitch metrics, meaning the horizontal and vertical break components can be obtained through any route. These movement buckets are the Deadzone fastball, the running fastball, the generic sinker, the gyro sinker, the running sinker, the heavy sinker, the heavy runner, and the diver. To visualize the different sinker profiles across the league, let's take a look at these classified sinker examples from Ryan Thompson, Joe Musgrove, and Jordan Hicks. In this series, we classified Thompson's sinker as a diver, Musgrove's as a heavy sinker, though it nears gyro sinker territory, and Jordan Hicks's as a dead zone fastball. We'll work our way from the top of this movement chart, meaning closer to four-seamers, all the way to the bottom, where we get into our diver territory. Like sinkers and four-seam profiles, the classified sinker that moves like a four-seamer is quite scarce, though it's not unheard of. It's made up 4% of sinkers over the past 2 seasons. There's not much to say here, other than these pitchers either prefer a sinker grip or simply have the thought process of throwing a sinker at release. Like we discussed in our four-seam video, the dead zone fastball is a pitch with equal parts vertical and horizontal movement. Shockingly, it is the most common sinker variant, making up 20% of all sinkers over the last 2 seasons. This is typically a tough pitch to have as a primary fastball, as it lacks a pure identity. That being said, we should contextualize this sinker to the pitcher's primary four-seamer if they have one. If a pitcher cuts their four-seamer, think of that relative cut profile we discussed in our four-seam video. Examples of this include Adam Wainwright and Sonny Gray. They'll have a decent shot at having some serious relative running action on the pitch, which may help the pitch play up despite being unimpressive in a vacuum. Outside of that though, it's not a profile that's highly sought after. Distinguishing itself a bit from the Deadzone heater, the running fastball makes up 15% of all classified sinkers. The main differential with this pitch and the Deadzone heater is above average arm side run to provide the pitch with a movement identity. It's fairly common for these sinkers to be high Magnus pitches from lower slots, essentially acting as four-seam fastballs from lower slots that have a higher proportion of side spin than backspin. Next up, we've got our first true sinker. The standard sinker has the second highest usage at 18%. What should stand out here is that nearly 35% of classified sinkers ended up above this classification line, mainly the running fastball and the Deadzone fastball. The standard sinker is the first pitch with league average depth, meaning the omission of too much positive vertical break. It's important to contextualize a pitch's arm slot here, as these pitches will play up when thrown from higher slots, due to both the fact the approach angle of the pitch will be steeper, plus the unique amount of non-Magnus movement that is required to pull the pitch down into true sinker territory. We will also have a runner variant based off of sinkers, and when we get to our next pitch type, the heavy sinker. When a pitch is a runner, it just means it's got well above average arm side run, and we feel the need to tag that to give it that personality and distinguish itself, as it just has a different movement profile. Overall, standard and running sinkers make up about 30% of all sinker profiles, with 8% of them having at least 18 inches of run and being tagged as a running sinker. We've been very optimistic about the gains a sinker can have when cutting the ball or creating some gyroscopic spin at release. However, there are some pitchers that may actually be cutting the ball too much or aren't necessarily getting a benefit from cutting it at, say, 60% efficiency instead of 80% efficiency. This is where our gyro sinkers come into play. These aren't all that common at 7%, and they aren't necessarily bad. A pitch model that doesn't take into account seam shifted wake is going to hate these pitches a lot more than one that does, as the raw movement metrics of this pitch aren't going to have great arm side run, but relative to where their spin-based arm side run is, it may be pretty good. If you saw our four-seam variant video, we discussed how the rider profiles were the money-making profiles. Well, our next three profiles are typically the money-making one for sinkers, starting with the heavy sinker. Heavy sinkers made up 12% of sinker usage across the last 2 seasons. These shouldn't be considered the equivalent of a high-lift heater. Each pitch has a completely different method of generating outs, but this pitch has a serious identity due to its depth. As Framber Valdez is able to limit carry to just 5 inches from a league average release height due to axis deviation following release. Tate is an example of a hurler who mixes a relatively low slot with a good amount of depth following release to achieve well above average depth on the pitch. Combined with the heavy runner, the heavy sinker variants make up about 20% of all sinkers. Heavy runners make up just 6% of all sinkers, showing the rarity of well above average depth and elite arm side run. If you follow Pitching Ninja, Blake Trinan is likely the best pitcher to use for a visual of what this pitch looks like. The uniqueness is maximized due to his near 6'5" release height, about half a foot higher than the big league average. Our final movement profile for the sinker is the diver, and is generally the most sought after. We aren't even going to make a bucket for horizontal break due to the overall scarcity of this profile. Divers are nearly impossible to throw from regular release heights, even with elite amounts of non-Magnus movement. This profile is truly the moneymaker for sinker ballers, especially when thrown from anything above a 5-foot release height. Logan Webb, Randy Dobnak, and Aaron Bummer are each a part of that crew, having higher slots and eliminating depth. Careful readers will note that velocity is significantly lower on this offering. This is largely due to the fact that most of its usage is made up from sidearm or submarine hurlers. One thing we didn't note, largely due to the fact it wasn't in the scope of this video, was the sinker's generally negative influence on changeup quality. If you look at pitch movement league-wide, it's very difficult to generate separation off the sinker relative to the four-seamer. Thus, good command and/or velocity separation off the fastball is typically required for a sinker baller. We can also see how hitters would be far more susceptible to pounding diver-type profiles into the ground relative to regular sinkers from this chart. One of the tools we utilize at Driveline Baseball to project pitch quality is the Blob. The Blob allows us to plug in pitch metrics, mainly velocity, horizontal, and vertical break, and summarize the quality of the pitch based just on its ball flight characteristics. For instance, if you're deciding between whether or not you should throw a four-seamer or a sinker, you could simply leverage the Blob and compare those pitch shapes. This Stuff Plus model was developed by Driveline's Chief Research Officer, Dan O'Coin. Appreciate everyone for following along today. We'll have a video touching on how to throw a sinker coming out very soon. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and feel free to subscribe. Once again, if you have any comments, please leave them below. This is a pretty complex topic in which we could really go down a rabbit hole if we needed to, but we couldn't include all of this in just a 10-minute video. Thanks again for watching.